I grew up in Waterloo, Iowa, very white state, but the migration that brought Black people to Waterloo was an agrarian migration. These were sharecroppers from the South, and my grandmother didn't even have a middle school education. She had to quit school before she finished 5th grade. So we didn't have a Black community that had a connection to college at all, or that had a connection to historically Black colleges. And I went to majority white school. And my parents put us in the program. It was called open enrollment because they were concerned we wouldn't get a proper education in our segregated neighborhood schools. So starting from the 2nd grade, I rode the bus 2 hours every day to a school on the white side of town. It was the wealthiest, whitest school. And so it was fraught in many of the ways that desegregation is fraught. Our schools weren't integrated. There were a handful of Black kids in white schools, and also we were working class going into wealthy schools. So I think I experienced kind of the best and the worst of public education in that I got a really good public education. At the end of the day, when all the other kids walked home, we had to get on a bus and get shipped back to our side of town. And there was a lot of racial conflict and angst in my experience. So I think it would have been different had we had a truly integrated educational experience, but busing usually only went one way. So they called it desegregation or integration, but the white kids were not being bused into our schools. But of course, I've often wondered if I had remained in my segregated schools, would I have gotten the type of education that allowed me to become the person that I ultimately did? And I don't know the answer to that, but the data and the research shows that the odds would have been against me. I would have loved to have had an academic experience where I wasn't always not having to prove myself, because students have to prove, of course, that they're good students, and that type of challenge is good. But just to prove my basic humanity, right? My basic intelligence, my basic right to be there, that just feels like that would be so liberating. And whenever I talk to students who have gone to historically Black colleges, that's how they feel about it. So when I was applying for colleges, the only colleges I knew about were predominantly white colleges. And I can actually remember how I discovered there was such a thing, which is I got into the University of Notre Dame and I was looking around for scholarships, and I saw this organization called the National Negro College Fund. So I contacted them and they said they only gave scholarships to Black colleges. And I remember being like, wait, there's Black colleges? I had no idea, but by then it was too late. I'd already accepted at Notre Dame. It was late to be applying and trying to figure college out. But I've often said one of the few regrets I have in life, I don't tend to be a backwards looking person for my own life, was that I wasn't aware that there were historically Black colleges and that I did not attend one. When I think about my experience at the University of Notre Dame, it was an experience of always being the outsider, of feeling at all times that I wasn't really supposed to be there, of always being one of the only ones. I think many Black students tend to have a very limited experience of college when we go to predominantly white institutions. When you go to a historically Black college, you, for one of the only times in your life, get to be surrounded by high-achieving Black folks in a completely Black setting, at a setting that's designed for you. When I'm on Howard's campus or A&T's campus or Central's campus, and you look at the buildings are named after Black people, the art on the wall, the portraits are Black people. It's an experience that you don't really have anywhere else in America, and affirming that kind of long history of academic striving, to be surrounded by that and not just always have to live in opposition, right? Like so often when we're at predominantly white institutions, it's succeeding in spite of, right? It's trying to find a way. It's trying to prove that you belong. We know how to even the playing field in education. It's not rocket science. I mean, first of all, you have to fund schools equally, which actually doesn't mean providing all the schools identical funding. If you're serving a population that is more disadvantaged, if you're concentrating poverty in schools, then those schools clearly will need more money to do the same things. We've never provided all of our children equal access to a quality education. That's the same thing for colleges. We know that historically Black colleges have never received the type of funding, even within a state system, that white colleges have, because Black Black Americans for the first 250 years in our country were not allowed to acquire any wealth. Our institutions don't have the endowments that white institutions have, but they're serving a much higher level of low-income students. So once again, Black institutions are tasked with serving a higher need community with fewer funds than other organizations. Funding is critical. Having access to the same types of facilities. I mean, really all of the same things that they were asking for in Brown v. Board of Education 60 years ago. We've never done that on scale for Black kids in this country. And then when Black kids' test scores somehow miraculously don't match those of schools that have higher levels of curriculum, better instruction, better facilities, then we want to blame Black families and Black children when the inequality is structural. We know what to do. There's a reason every Black child is raised with the adage that you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. It's not fair. It's a burden to put on a Black student. I mean, my good friend Ta-Nehisi, one of the things he always says is freedom is the ability to be mediocre, right? Like we shouldn't have to always work harder, do more, but that's not the society that we live in. We have a society that doesn't value Black children, that doesn't value Black intellect, that believes that if we're in these spaces, it's because we somehow didn't deserve to be there. So it's this constant having to prove, and that is exhausting, and it's also impossible because none of us are ever going to be able at all times to be the exceptional Black person. And this is where that idea of respectability comes into that. Black people have to be perfect in every way in order to succeed, but other groups aren't expected to have perfection, and none of us can be that way. So I think, again, this speaks to the value of Black institutions, is an understanding that Black people, we exist in the full spectrum of life just like any other group of people. We will make mistakes. Many of us will succeed and many of us will struggle. And that is what life is. So I think that the benefit of having these institutions and supporting these institutions is we know that when Black students are in those environments, they thrive. So we know that if Black students are affirmed and given an education that respects them as human beings, that also understands that a student who comes in academically behind doesn't mean that that student isn't ambitious or motivated. It means that they have been failed in their educational institutions prior to that. And historically, Black institutions take the student as a whole. And they're actually, instead of being built to weed out Black students, they are built around the idea that we as a race rise together. And so we have to support all of our students. And I think that's a beautiful thing.